going to start by asking the three panelists to give us some introductory remarks, focusing specifically on their fields of expertise or fields of interest, and not on the sort of general impressions of what we saw at Parliament and on our television screens last night, and what we heard when we could hear anything.
I think from my side, there are at least three things that I would like that kind of stood out for me and I thought would be important to highlight. I think firstly, is the quality of the speech, obviously. I think the time as South Africans have come to accept that the speech itself tends to lack in depth. It's very broad, very broad reporting on various aspects that the president spoke to. But I think a more concerning issue coming out of this speech is the focus of the speech. I think it's very important, obviously, to focus on issues pertaining to macroeconomy outlook, where the country is going and so forth, because unemployment is a serious issue. But what did concern me in particular was the fact that the president's speech was very far removed from the soul of the nation. What I mean by that is that I think in South Africa at the moment we are in a very critical period in terms of issues relating to social cohesion. I think the past couple of weeks, for example, we saw what happened in Soweto. There were terrible attacks against foreign nationals in Soweto, but also just last week, a 9-year-old in Durban, Phoenix, was murdered. And that's just one incident where we are seeing increasing levels of violence and abuse against children and women as well. But also we had the race attacks in Cape Town. So what for me this represents, it represents a nation that is in crisis and in need of deep reflection about where it's going, but also the side of the nation, about this idea of the nation, who is the nation, this idea of nation building. And it's also been reflected in various kind of articles that came out in the past weeks that we are a nation in need of healing. And I think that aspect, for me at least, was missing in the speech of the president. I think that it was a critical time for the president to provide leadership on that aspect and really kind of galvanize the nation together in terms of forming this rainbow nation, this idea of a united, prosperous South Africa towards, what the NDP envisions for 2013. And he failed, on my opinion, to do that. But I think also the failure to do so, to reflect on these issues that relate to social cohesion, I think it also points to the extent of alienation between the state and citizens. I think increasingly we're seeing that. I think in our own public opinion data that we have in-house, the reconciliation barometer, we are seeing increasing levels of disillusionment in terms of state institutions, particularly the executive. Just the results that came out from the reconciliation barometer, declining levels of trust in Parliament as an institution that has to play a very important oversight role, and also is the voice of citizens to the executive, but also declining trust in the confidence levels for the presidency. So this institution, this administration, Zuma's administration in particular, has alienated itself further from the citizens of South Africa, and I think that was reflected in his address yesterday. And I think this alienation that we see is also a cumulative effect of the lack of political will from this administration, the lack of political accountability, I meant to say, but also the lack of moral authority. Disregard for the rule of law. We've seen how on various occasions the state has actually interfered with institutions of democracy that are meant to be independent, function as independent institutions that are there to safeguard our democracy. But also it's a cumulative effect of how citizens are saying that the state is increasingly using its coercive power to infringe on the rights and the freedoms that are enshrined on the Constitution in terms of, you know, citizens' rights and participation, freedom of speech. We saw that yesterday as well. So that's the first point I wanted to raise. I think the second point for me that was important and would have expected the President to give more emphasis on related to the issue of youth in particular. Youth in relation to jobs, youth in relation to education. We vaguely spoke about the youth, but what troubled me in his section which he was talking about youth, the need for jobs and so forth, is the fact that we have a draft national youth policy that's out at the moment, and it's out for public comments. And this policy is meant to be a key instrument to drive youth development in the country in terms of job. It's meant to be a key instrument for the mainstreaming of youth in the economy. Yet the President did not make a single mention to this policy. What he has done, in fact, was to talk about the NYDA as an important, you know, machinery to drive youth development. But we know that the National Youth Development Agency has long lost credibility, especially among young people, as a key instrument or as a key institutional mechanism for youth development. But also, secondly, I think it was a terrible mistake for the President to announce that they would inject additional funds in billions into this institution against the backdrop of the 2010, where the NYDA executives spent lots of money, wasteful expenditure on a youth batch of some sort related to the World Cup, and yet we still want to inject additional funds into this agency. For me, that's problematic. But also, in terms of the funds that have been allocated to the NYDA, I think also what's troubling me is the fact that since the NYDA has replaced also WOFU and all these other agencies that were there before it was formed, is the fact that there hasn't been an impact assessment study of the programs that it runs and spends the state resources on. And it's running a lot of programs and a lot of money is being injected to it, but most of that money is allocated to salaries, and I think that's problematic. If I can make just one last point, in terms of the key highlights for me, was also the issue of education in relation to young people. The President focused a lot on schools infrastructure. For me, that's a bit problematic. I think on the one hand, it's important in terms of equity to access, but I don't think that you're going to transform education by focusing just on infrastructure. I think the critical aspect has to do with what happens in the classroom. We know the issues relating to the quality of education in our schools. We know that the teachers are not well equipped to be able to teach, how to teach their curriculum, even themselves. They were not able to, you know, to even meet the standards that the learners themselves are expected to meet. And so, but also, you know, we had the matric results that came out now. It was a big drop, not a big drop, but worrying drop from 2013 National Senior Certificate pass rate to the one that we had in 2014. But also the annual National Assessments results were also released in December 2014. They showed dismal results in terms of how we're doing at a foundational level. And for me, I would have expected that the President would address what is the turnaround strategy on these aspects, and he failed to do that.
Ayanda has covered quite a lot of ground in terms of the things that I would like to sort of allude to. Firstly, I think it's very difficult to make an objective, unclouded comment, I think, about last night's speech without referring to what has happened before, because it gives us an idea also of the modus operandi of the state. And I think that's been really sort of worrisome. I think a very sort of authoritarian stream that's sort of seeping within our, or into our body.
But the point that I wanted to make was that I wouldn't want us to dwell too much on that, because I'm sure people in the audience is going to ask about that also. That's why I really want you to, when the speech was eventually delivered, certain things were said or not said, and that's where I want us to focus as a start.
Yeah. Which brings me to the speech then, and I think
nice segue.
That I think even sort of if these things did not happen before, and I think objectively speaking, last night's speech was probably one of the worst ones that I've seen of the president. I think what we need right now in South Africa is a particular vision, some predictability. As a sort of globally, sort of emerging countries find themselves in a predicament as far as the economy is concerned. But I think also domestically we are struggling, and therefore we need some kind of certainty, some kind of vision that shows us where we're going. Although we cannot control too much of what is happening sort of globally, we should be able to control the levers that are within our sort of disposal in South Africa. Things like what is happening with our state-operated enterprises, for example. What is happening to our oversight institutions. I think these are things that are within our control, things that can allow us to create a bit more certainty of where we are heading to as a country. Also, the kinds of values of the society that we espouse. Really sort of missing for me is the narrative, the broader narrative. If one just thinks last night sort of how much the president has referred to things like poverty and inequality, I think it's appeared almost nowhere in the speech. We have, so there has been reference to unemployment, but I think on a very superficial level, I think the president was saved by the unemployment statistics or the quarterly labour force survey that came out this week. There was a marginal increase in the number of South Africans who has got sort of jobs, but it's very difficult to ascribe that to any kind of government intervention, because in the previous quarter it went down. So so I think there has been this vagueness, this absence of a narrative. And in 2012, when the National Development Plan was launched, I think a lot of people were excited about it, because if you sort of followed the opinion pages in the sort of especially in the latter part of the previous decade, you had so many people saying that what we need as a country is a vision. We need something that we can all work towards. And then came the NDP in 2012, and one had sort of fairly broad buy-in by many constituencies. But one does get the impression these days that it's merely becoming an incantation, just in response to when government is being asked, so what are you doing? Government says NDP, and over the past year, radical economic transformation, but we don't really know what it means. Is it the NDP on steroids or what? But there is this growing divergence between what is promised and the reality. For example, last night the president talks about beneficiation, the extent to which we should be able to draw more or extract more value out of our own resources. But we also know that the beneficiation sector requires energy, something that we do not have at the moment. So, I think there are countless examples of how we're talking in one direction and how the reality is moving in a different direction. And unfortunately, I think that has got an impact on the state of the nation.
The points that the president made in his speech, the usual platitudes about building a better Africa, and the African Union, you might be surprised to learn, featured twice in the speech. Now, I'm not going to do a test because I know you're not going to succeed in passing. But the first reference was that the issue of the African Union anthem will from now on, as of this year, be sung at schools. so that all of South Africa's children can learn about this very important item to inculcate a Pan-African identity, so to speak, yeah? Part of the agenda of building a better Africa. I will chalk this up as a positive element of the speech, maybe perhaps the only one. Part of the problem in our continent is that there is no sense of African unity. Even though the continent exists, we share borders, challenges in one country spill over to another country. I think it's very important to foster a sense of Pan-Africanness. Particularly in the context of the apartheid regime, which proactively, in fact, and some would argue very effectively, in fact, managed to manipulate the consciousness of South Africans, to believe that they are a world apart from the rest of Africa, to see the north of Limpopo as the realm of savagery and banana republics. And after yesterday's experiences and the securitization of parliament, is this perception that's coming home to roost. So the sentiments that we find across South Africa, a significant number of South Africans, based largely on anecdotal evidence, is including well-informed middle classes, and the perpetrators of xenophobic violence, which we've seen now in Soweto, 2008, 62 people died, is the sense that Africa is somewhere else out there, some other really unknown. So I think this is a very important aspect of the speech that should be commended. Secondly, the speech made reference to supporting peace and security and regional integration on the African continent. South Africa is playing a leading role in the UN-mandated MONUSCO Force Intervention Brigade in the Eastern DRC. The force has had some limited success in quelling the armed militia in that part of the world, despite the challenges of the constantly shifting alliances. South Africa is implicated quite heavily in African Union and UN peacekeeping operations, and the speech noted that the SA Defense, National Defense Force and the police force, SAPs, are continuing to participate in conflict prevention and peacekeeping across the continents. For example, the FUR SA remains very actively involved. Somalia, through the African Union mission in Somalia. And so the speech confirmed the operationalization of what is called the African capacity for the immediate response to crisis. It is a bit of a mouthful. The acronym is ACIRC. You can play on that word, ACIRC, a circus, but you're not going to go there. South Africa is a contributing member to this framework. Now, why did this happen? The African Union had historically intended to establish what is called an African standby force, but through challenges, political, diplomatic challenges, financial challenges, this has not yet materialized. So this ACIRC concept has been established almost as a stopgap measure to allow a rapid deployment to become a reality. Why is South Africa interested in this? You will recall the Central African Republic debacle, in which South Africa went at it alone to secure the country. 13 soldiers died, that's citizens of this country. This was made worse by the revelation that there was political interest, ANC, financial interests in exploiting natural resources in CAR. So questions could be raised in the future about such interventions in terms of Pan-African law and continental jurisdiction and international law as well. So I think ACIRC is necessary to cover the future military adventures that might become commonplace. Third point referred to conflict resolution efforts going on in Lesotho, Sri Lanka, South Sudan. As you recall, Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa was appointed in the last SONA as the special envoy of SA to South Sudan and Sri Lanka. Our neighbors, I don't know if they really can describe them as neighbors because we kind of encircle them, Lesotho, have had a lot of governance challenges, and SA is always implicated in trying to solve those problems. We all are familiar with the 15th of December 2013 war that broke out in South Sudan. Very brutal war that's been going on. IGR is actively involved in working in South Sudan. You can follow some of our work on that. And so it's an important, if you will, intervention for South Africa. As an aside, Robert Mugabe is now the chairman of the Assembly of Heads of State of the African Union. We can go into that. Fourth point, very quickly. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, deepening cooperation on that front, a new development bank, that is a BRICS bank, and a treaty to establish a contingent reserve arrangement, which is kind of a way to bypass the IMF and the World Bank to a large extent, which still remain dominated by, let's be frank, the United States and Western countries. So this means that fiscal stability in these countries and development finance becomes determined by and dictated to a certain extent by Western countries. So this is BRICS coming of age, BRICS being a counterpoint, if you will, in the world economy, to the US-dominated economy. Fifth, in the language that the President was using, he was referring to the West, Europe, and United States of America. The language was one of reassuring, almost to say, look, we haven't forgotten you, but he quoted, he said, countries in the developing North remain important strategic partners for SA, as if there was, in fact, a doubt that they might be still partners. And a lot is made in diplomatic circles, even in South Africa and Pretoria, about how SA is giving a cold shoulder to European countries, and the US, EU diplomats and government officials routinely complain about the ability to access key decision makers in Pretoria. But I don't know if we should read too much into this because of the Africa focus and the BRICS, if you will. Turn, I'm almost there yet. That's 2 points. The EU partnership is very much alive and well. A reference made to a 1.5 billion rand investment program in South Africa, and if that's not engaging, I don't know what is. The US-Africa Summit, in which a whole coterie of our African leaders rushed off to Washington for a group photo with Barack Obama. Not necessary in my view. But the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, remains important for African industries, particularly textile, leveraging that, in fact, to make sure that industries in Africa remain competitive. But I don't think we have enough analysis of the extent to which, for example, AGOA is, in fact, concretely contributing towards the growth and development of our industries, particularly when we take into account the cheaper imports coming from China that are in fact decimating these industries. Last point, and 6.5 minutes gone. This year is the 70th anniversary of the United Nations system, whose charter was drafted around 1942. The system, the UN system, remains biased towards the West again. The permanent 5 members of the Security Council include the US, France, the UK, China, and Russia. And the argument made by African countries quite consistently is that the system, in fact, does not work anymore, and it needs to be changed. So the language in the speech was one of transforming the United Nations system, and with specific reference to the United Nations Security Council.